how we will proceed is by asking each of the 5 groups to quickly show us the one slide that summarizes their voting records. That, I mean, there was no mail-in voting in this case, so there shouldn't be any confusion. But let us maybe wait a moment. In the meantime, I trust that each group has been able to identify a reporter for that particular exercise, and then we'll have a brief discussion on that before we go into the next topic, where again there will be a brief introduction and then group work. So the second part of this morning will be a bit more dedicated to group work and discussion than dedicated to listening to me, which is probably good balance. We'll follow for the group reports the order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that we have, that which was without any particular reflection on the order, but we'll follow the order. Group 1, planner statisticians. Group 2, education officers. Group 3, curriculum officers. Group 4, principals. Group 5, the chief, deputy chief, assistant chief, education officers, directors of education, and so on. Okay, I think everybody is back. I hope you had the chance to complete the group work, even if unavoidably it will have been shorter than you wanted it to be, I suppose, but sometimes it's good to have a deadline in this particular case to make sure that that you put things on paper. Let me listen to the reporter for group 1. And if you can at the same time, can we allow them to share their screen? I suppose that's possible, Ludivine. Okay, Miss Hyacinth, please. Yes. Perfect. Everybody. Okay, perfect. Well, Hyacinth, please go ahead.
Can you see my screen? Good morning, afternoon.
Good morning, and we can see your screen.
Okay, so we are the planners statistician group, and I don't know if it's surprisingly or coincidentally, we decided almost unanimously, because there are 13 of us, that evidence-based is our number 1 position. Then we decided also that 7 guided by overall vision is our second most important one as a group. No one chose holistic, and no one chose attention to disparities. I don't know if that's a reflection on what's really happening, but we were forced to choose 2, and we ended up coincidentally choosing based upon on our areas of strength. It appears. All right, so this is our from these planners and statisticians.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Hyacinth. That's in itself already interesting, but we'll continue listening to the next group, group 2, who will group 2 for the education officer. I'm not, well, I think there's something where you can do stop sharing, but I would imagine maybe you have on top view options there or something. Well, that's mine. If not, Ludivine, can you help Hyacinth to stop sharing, and can you allow somebody else to share?
Yes, I will.
Okay, group 2, who is the reporter for group 2?
Group 2 is education officers?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's Sophia, the reporter. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so for...
I thought we were group 3. Good morning, everybody. For curriculum officers. Group 3 is curriculum officers.
Wait a moment. Let us go to group 2.
Group 2 is which one?
Group 2 is education officers. Group 3 is curriculum officers.
Okay.
So Group 2, Miss Pistana, are you in Group 2?
I am, sir, and Vida is presenting.
Okay. Ah,
Okay,
and Vida is
so
presenting. Sorry,
yes.
a bit
Thanks,
confused.
Lisa.
Okay, well then, Vida, go ahead, please.
Okay, there were 11 of us, I think, in our group. And most of us agreed, as you can see, that our education plan must be guided by an overall vision. We must know what it is that we want to achieve. The next highest strategy we thought is that it's evidence-based. So if it's evidence-based, it's not something that is just being done out of the blue. It would be taken into context, sensitive, that it's coherent, and that it's achievable. So we are thinking that evidence-based is almost like an umbrella term also. So we have 4, but there's other persons in the group who thought that it is achievable and sensitive to the context.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just one little question. Does that mean, because you were quite a big group, does that mean that some of you only identified one characteristic as the most important and others identified 2?
Most of us identified 2. I think some of us got cut off while we were in the breakout. Yes, so I think that
okay.
Was in the wrong.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So the voting results will be contested.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll live with that for the time being. We're not electing a president. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That becomes interesting. Let's listen to Group 3, curriculum officers. That's now Miss Sophia.
Yes, that's Sophia.
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Good morning. There were, I think, 5 of us in the group, and we indicated that evidence-based. You would notice 5 persons selected evidence-based as one of the key areas. And then there was a split. We had 3 persons indicating that the plan should be sensitive to the context, and 1 each indicating is guided by an overall vision, is holistic, and is achievable. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's again very useful. And thanks also for the discipline and the respect of the rules. And so let's go to the principles, which again I think was a relatively small group. Who will present on behalf of the principals?
I want to say something that we did not get through a lot of what was to be done because there was a feedback that we couldn't get rid of. And so some discussion, they were lost because we couldn't hear. And so just about 3 persons contributed.
Okay, I'm sorry. You mean the audio wasn't good?
Somebody was we were getting a loud feedback, and our help, the technical person was trying to help us. She sent messages to the person whose mic was, and so we got into trouble. So, but what the 3 persons who got to vote, we had 2 persons saying that it should be holistic. 1 voted on evidence-based, 1 unachievable, 1 sensitive to context, and 1 pay attention to disparities.
Okay, thanks. So quite a wide range of opinions there.
But there are just 2 for holistic, so that's our greatest.
Okay, all right. So thanks very much. And then let's go to the last group, Group 5. Chief Education Officers, Directors of Education, Deputy Assistant Acting Chief Education Officers.
Okay, we have had 8 persons in our group, and the evidence-based was our top with 7. And then we had guided by overall vision 6. And of course we have strategic 1, achievable one, coherent one. And so that was, for most part, there was almost a unanimous vote for evidence-based being at the top. And with the rationale being with sectoral engagement and mobilizing resources are aligned with evidence-based decision-making, and the vision is aligned with the goal for a common future.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you just go back to the slide 4 that I can see also which were the ones that did not receive much attention? Okay, so indeed disparities, holistic, sensitive to the context. Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, okay, I think that's interesting. I'm a little surprised, I must admit, but maybe that's my own, well, it's better to be surprised in life than not. So what we see is that two elements, or one element, evidence-based, comes true with all groups, which is maybe not surprising, though it surprised me a little bit because I thought this was something that would be much more present among planners and statisticians than among other groups. But the argument that was made at the end by the chief education officers that indeed precisely the role of planning and of planners is to some extent to argue, not in the sense of being in disagreement, but to discuss with stakeholders and in particular political stakeholders on the base of evidence is a good point. It's interesting to see that coming back. The other issue that comes back very regularly is vision. I think every group identified vision, and planners, statisticians, education officers, and chief education officers put it also as one of the important characteristics. And I think that's also linked to the discussion we had before, that indeed the role of the education sector plan is to bring people together. So having a plan that presents a vision and is evidence-based to some extent finds the right balance between a plan that is both ambitious and realistic, a plan that has some political aspect to it in the sense of the policy priorities, and a plan that has some technical aspect to it. I was surprised maybe a little that the issue of disparities, except in the group of principals where one person identified that, but for the rest it came back very little. Can somebody explain maybe why? Was it discussed in any of the groups? Not that you had much time to discuss. Or can you see why you think that the issue of disparities did not receive much, that you do not think it to be a key element? Is that related to your particular context? Who feels they can intervene on this for a minute?
Can I try? Good afternoon, morning. Hyacinth. I think that because of the context of the OECS, it's only in most recent times that we have been, and maybe from Montserrat, we've been paying as much attention as we should to disparities. So the education system has been going along, and most of the time we had all English speakers, for instance, in Montserrat. And then of late, it's only now in past 10 years. So we have been able to plan without having that in. And because you forced, now we are aware that we need to have it in, but you forced us to just choose two. So that would not have come as a top for us. You know, I'm thinking it has to do with our context.
Vida,
okay.
may I ask something?
Yes,
I would
please.
like to add something. I am thinking if something is evidence-based, then it takes into context that you look at the sensitivity of the plan. You should be also be focusing on disparity, because that is also part of evidence. And so that is why I think evidence-based got most of the vote from our group.
I am thinking too that if you are looking at something that is holistic, then it would take in disparities.
Yes, that is correct to some extent, but holistic wasn't identified as a particularly important aspect either, because I think it was only in the group of principals and maybe a little the curriculum officers that holistic was identified. For the rest, holistic was not identified as as an important characteristic. But the point is well taken. But I think I understand that the argument that if something is evidence based, it will allow us to almost to I would say almost automatically reach a good plan because it's evidence based, and that plan will take into account disparities when the evidence highlights disparities is a good point. At the same time, I think we need to be careful though that evidence is regularly contested and that evidence can lead us into different directions. Let me give one example which is quite let me give two examples. Improving teachers, and I already referred to that a little bit, improving teacher performance. There is quite some evidence to argue that you need stronger teacher accountability, you need stronger teacher monitoring, you need stronger teacher control. And as a result, if teachers are feeling accountability for the result of students, they will improve. And then you will have quite a bit of evidence to argue that what teachers actually need is more professional development, more support. They need to, which is not only training, but more mentoring, more coaching, support by the principal, support by the heads of department, support by the education officers, and so on. And it's only when they get that support, then they will actually be improving, and then you can hold them accountable. And these are, and you will see in countries that these lead to two very different policy packages, and the interpretation of the evidence itself is not always, it's not an automatic translation. Evidence does not automatically translate into policy. The second example I wanted to give was the example with school autonomy. In many countries, again, there was an argument to say that, look, if we simply allow schools, you give schools a budget, you give a grant to schools, and let them decide what is best for the school, that will improve the system. And then there are other countries where there is other research that tends to demonstrate that as a result, you will have more disparities. Some schools will manage this very well, other schools will manage this badly, and you will have more disparities. So I very much understand the importance of evidence-based, but I don't think it is fully correct to say that, okay, the evidence will automatically translate into policies. There is still a lot of yeah. I'm not looking at the chat, otherwise I get a bit confused. But I see ideas coming up there, which I'm sure are correct. That was important. What was a bit of a surprise for me, maybe to finish on this, but then I'll allow a bit more discussion though, is that actually a surprise, and a happy surprise, is that to a large extent these 5 different groups, with maybe the principles a bit different, but you also mentioned you had a bit of difficulty there to bring everybody in, but that these 5 different groups to a large extent agree on similar characteristics, evidence-based and vision. That was the case for planner statisticians, for EOs, for CEOs, and for the curriculum officers, at least the issue of evidence-based. They emphasized the importance of context. And that's in principle good, because that allows us to find common terrain on which to work. That's maybe also partly because many colleagues have had a somewhat similar career. Many of us started in schools, go into the administration, go up the career ladder, and so on. So that might make for an easier way of bringing people together. I'm not really sure. Let me maybe stop there. There are still other points we could raise, but I think these were the most important. Are there other issues that one of you wants to voice? We can still take 2-3 minutes.
Yes, I just want to ask a question quickly. As it relates to being strategic, I understand in terms of what you were saying in terms of the example about teachers and the needs, and maybe looking at it at different ways. Even as we collectively put together a vision and the way we're going to achieve this vision and so on, how much of an emphasis would being strategic be placed in such a conversation?
Yeah, I think it's actually very important, and I'm but you know, my opinion doesn't count for more than others, but I would have, but that's partly also my own background, the countries that I've worked in recently. I would have put indeed attention to disparities a bit higher on the agenda, and maybe also strategic, because I think one challenge that I see in many education systems is that we, and I'm part of that community, we tend to rely on relatively similar strategies in order to improve our education systems, even if those strategies have no longer or do no longer demonstrate their usefulness. That I think we'll have that discussion much more in modules 3 and 4 than in this particular module. But I think it's an important point that when I look at many different education plans in this region, but beyond this region, I see too little change maybe over time. And that does mean that some of the strategies that we've relied on 15, 20, 25 years ago, that we still believe in these strategies. And maybe sometimes that's correct, but maybe sometimes it is simply that we are all people of habit. And we are also maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe I think the fact that many of us have grown up in the education system and the education administration, and as a result there was a bit of group think, as they say. There was a bit of common thinking, and while that brings us together, it also maybe means that we have too many similar opinions about what works and what does not work, and we do not get enough challenging thoughts from outside. I'm saying that with some hesitation, and I'm saying that with hypothesis and so on in it, but I tend to think that that doesn't mean that everything has to be changed. That doesn't mean that innovation in itself is valuable, because innovation can be not relevant. But I think what it implies is that we need to reflect indeed critically on the different strategies that we have been using over years to address the different challenges in the education system, and be ready to change and be ready to rethink. And that for me is the purpose of saying strategic. But as I say, we'll have more discussion on that, I think, in module 3 in particular, when we will be looking at issues of priorities and strategies. Okay, other points? If not, we'll go to the next set of our discussions. In the chat, I think these are more points of view, and I think these are indeed useful points of view. So maybe if you allow me, I'll go ahead with the next session or the next discussion, which will be a relatively short introduction, and then again some group work. And for that I need to share my screen again. Let's take this. So we have looked at the characteristics of education sector planning, and now what we want to look at a bit more is what are the different activities in the education planning process. And this could be a very lengthy presentation, but I've decided to make it really very short, because the next modules will to a large extent enter in the detail of each of these different activities. And to a large extent, this is not a very surprising set of activities. What you can see here, and for those of you who have received the presentation already, you can follow it also. To a large extent, education planning, as most planning exercises, is actually about 4 major questions, 4 basic questions, and the logic is almost unbeatable. It starts with a sort of diagnosis or an analysis of where are we today. And that is, as I said, what we will be examining in module 2. Then we want to identify more in detail where do we want to go to. We were discussing that from in the beginning, that this is the role of education planning, and you were mentioning it, that this is the vision that we want to formulate, and all of you highlighted this as an important aspect. Where would we like to be in the future? And that is the policy formulation, where we select overall goals, but start thinking indeed about the strategies to achieve those goals. Then the next step is evidently, okay, what do we need to do in order to achieve that vision? And that is finding the right balance between the objectives and the resources we have available. It is also reflecting on the different possible constraints to implementation of that vision. Constraints which can be human constraints, which can be financial constraints, which can be institutional constraints in the way we function as schools, in the way we function as district offices, in the way we function as ministries of education. And finally, and something that has been emphasized already quite regularly, how do we know that we are going in the right direction? How do we know that we are indeed implementing what we want to implement and achieving what we want to achieve? And how can we change direction if a change in direction is needed? And for that, we need, of course, evidence, that is monitoring. And indeed, the evidence-based aspect of planning is present in each of these 4 types of activities, very much in the first and the last, but it is throughout there. You can put that in a bit more detail in this graph, or in this figure, where we have highlighted a little bit more these steps into some more detail. We tend to start with an education sector analysis. The analysis allows us to identify policy priorities and strategies, but the priorities are never an immediate response to the analysis. Sometimes we might have priorities which are more the result of the overall socioeconomic development of the country than the result of the sector analysis. But nevertheless, the analysis certainly feeds into the identification of policy priorities and strategies in order to achieve those particular policy priorities. A typical policy priority would be to improve learning at all levels of the education system. We will go into the program design. We improve learning by improving teachers, by improving the functioning of schools, by improving the way schools are being monitored and supported, by improving textbooks, and so on and so forth. And these will then be the programs. At that moment, but actually already earlier, we will also work on the cost and financing, in the sense that we will examine, okay, if we want indeed to achieve these particular objectives, we want to improve learning by having, for instance, better qualified teachers, what will be the financial implications? We want to improve the relevance of our education system by expanding technical and vocational education, be it at secondary or post-secondary level. What will be the financial implications? And so what will be the total cost? And what funding will be available? What funding do we expect to be available over the next 5 or 10 years? And that costing and financing exercise will feed back, and that's why you have these while you have these arrows that are crossing here, will feed back, because we may decide that actually our plan is not sufficiently ambitious. We have more funding than than the plan needs at the moment. So let's become more ambitious. Or, and that's the usual scenario, we will say, actually, what we want to do, we might not be able to afford it financially, and therefore we need to rethink it. And so we will rework the policy Usually, we will not rethink the priorities, but we will rather rethink the targets that are linked to each priority. We're not going to say we're not going to improve quality, but we may say, okay, look, improving teacher qualifications is maybe not something we can afford now to do for all teachers. Let's do that for all the new recruits or anything like that. So there will be an interaction there. We'll give an example at a certain moment or in a few minutes. In many cases, then, an education plan that is a global plan will be accompanied by an action plan. We're not going to discuss that too much at the moment. We will discuss also the implementation arrangements, who will be responsible for what in implementing the plan. And then, of course, with the whole exercise of monitoring and evaluation. And you can see there also between, for instance, the implementation arrangements and the programs that there is again an interaction, because we may want, for instance, to improve teacher qualifications. But for that, of course, we need to have the relevant teacher training institutions or universities and so on. So that these are the different steps in the preparation of an education plan, and to a large extent, the different steps in any planning process in some detail here. On the side there, on the left side of the screen, you see something that we tend to forget quite regularly, and something that indeed in his first question Rafer already referred to, is always your consultation. Much of what you see from the education sector analysis all the way to monitoring and evaluation, much of this can be done, and much of this at times is done by a relatively small group of people within a central Ministry of Education. And that has the advantage of efficiency, but undoubtedly the disadvantage of lack of ownership throughout the system. And therefore it's important to have these moments of consultations at different moments. And this is, and I think in the education system, this is probably more true than in many other sectors, because in education, there is finally, I mean, almost every single actor in the education system has an opinion. Many of us started as teachers, and we know that teachers are, if I may say so, opinionated people, in the sense that they have strong opinions and hold strongly to them, and that can only be worthy, but that makes it more difficult, of course, to manage those opinions. But then it's not only teachers, parents have their point of view, of course, different groups that organize schools, private school organizers, religious groups, and so on have their points of view. And so these consultations have to allow for or we have to construct these consultations in such a way that they feed into the process. That's not an easy issue, and if necessary, we'll come back to that a little later, maybe again during module 3, when we will look more at the whole issue of priority setting. Now, this process looks like a relatively logical process. Well, it is a logical process, but and the way it's presented here, it almost seems like sequential. You see the strong red arrows going down, but it is not sequential as much as iterative. It's a process where regularly we have to take a step back. And that is for different reasons. Cost implications, I will refer to already to that, but I'll give an example, a concrete example from a country that worked with not too long ago. Implementation constraints, but also precisely the inputs from stakeholders. And let me give one concrete example to illustrate a bit better what is meant here. We worked not too long ago in a particular country where the minister, in part because of a political promise by the party to which she belonged, wanted really to ensure a quick expansion of upper secondary education. What would be called A levels, I'm not sure exactly the term you still use here. And through an increase in the net enrollment rate from 60% to 95% within 5 years, which was the period of the plan, but also to a large extent the period of what she hoped to be her ministerial post. And that was to some extent the declaration that the minister imposed upon her planning officers and upon the chief education officer, and so on. And there were with that declaration at least 3 problems. The first problem was that children are not born at the age of 17 or 18. So you cannot get somebody in upper secondary school if they haven't been in primary and lower secondary school and haven't dropped out. And therefore, the children you will want in upper secondary education in 5 years from now must be now already at the end of primary, the beginning of lower secondary. The ones you want in upper secondary education in 2 years from now, of course, they must now almost be at the last year of lower secondary. You can't just create children at a certain age. So the first question was, are there enough students in primary and lower secondary to complete upper secondary education within 5 years? And that was a simple mathematical calculation to a large extent. And that's where the simulation model becomes useful. No, even if all students in the base year would continue and complete upper secondary, the maximum net enrollment rate would be 90%, because there are simply not enough students now who were in at the end of primary or in lower secondary to continue into upper secondary. So that was the first point. 95% was mathematically impossible, or you had to import thousands of students from another country, which was not an option. The second problem was that we also needed teachers, and in particular, that we needed teachers with high qualifications, because upper secondary education, you needed at least a bachelor's and not a master's. And the idea, therefore, the question was, could teacher training colleges produce enough upper secondary school teachers? And here again, that was impossible. An increase to 90% would demand training too many additional upper secondary school teachers, which the existing colleges could not handle. And even with the creation of some new colleges, and that takes some time, you create a college now, it is not immediately functional. Even in the best scenario, it's functional in 1 or 2 years or so. And even by increasing the student-teacher ratios in the existing teacher training colleges, and even by upgrading some lower secondary school teachers to upper secondary school teachers, even then, the maximum net enrollment rate to be achieved would only be about 86%. And then the third test was, of course, the test of finances. Because upper secondary classrooms, upper secondary laboratories, and all that sort of thing, they are quite expensive. The unit cost of an upper secondary school student is much higher than the unit cost of a primary school student. And the financial implication was heavy. One option would have been to shift funding away from primary or lower secondary to upper secondary, or to shift it away, for instance, from early childhood education to upper secondary. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because you can't have an upper secondary school system that functions if primary and lower secondary function badly and students drop out too early. So you have to keep that balance. So there again, in order to bring then the target to what was feasible, but still ambitious, but feasible, the target could only be 82%, which is still a big increase, of course, from 60% to 82%. But it was not the almost universal upper secondary education that the minister would have wanted to achieve within 5 years. And so I think it's based on a true example, a real ministry and a real discussion. It shows how the education process, or the planning process, the plan preparation process, is both an iterative process, and it also shows that it is a process that has different characteristics. It is a technical process, in the sense that it analyzes and uses data. It employs logical framework. Here, the example shows clearly how the arguments that were presented to the minister were, to a large extent, technical arguments. They are not political arguments. They are not arguments, no, madam, we disagree with your option. The argument was more, no, madam, what you are asking is based on the evidence, simply not possible, or would lead to forcing us into choices which are not advisable. It is at the same time, the education planning process, it is at the same time a political process, and not political in the negative term of the word that it's petty politics, but political in the fact that it is inspired by an overall vision of what a government and hopefully the nation as a whole considers to be important for the development of the nation. In this case, it was considered that without a strengthening of upper secondary education, this particular country could not remain competitive in its own context. And the expansion of upper secondary education was considered a major element in the overall socio-economic vision of the country. So it's also a political process, and it is also a strategic process that comes back to the question of one of the colleagues, in the sense that it also demands that we reflect on the most pertinent strategies and reforms. Because in the example I gave, one option could have been to reflect on an overall reform of upper secondary education and have an upper secondary education system where, for instance, there was a lot of apprenticeships, whereby students who have completed lower secondary education would not continue into upper, but would continue into an apprenticeship scheme with informal or formal in the informal or formal economic sector with employers and so on. That was not considered in this particular country to a large extent because the economy could not integrate many of these students. There were not enough employers to some extent who could do that, but it would have been an alternative. And so it's I think important to keep in mind that there are these different characteristics of the education planning process, and these different characteristics also means that different people play different roles. So the group work that we would like you to do now, and I prefer maybe not to open this now for questions, except if there's something extremely urgent, because the group work, I would like to foresee at least some 40 minutes for the group work. It is now 11:30 here. We could come back around 12:10, and then we'll have group reports and a very brief discussion, and we'll be finished by 12:30, which is what we wanted to do because this distance work is always a bit demanding. So the group work is now again, and it's linked to discussions we had before, to the need for ownership, to the need for consultation, to the usefulness of a bottom-up planning process, but also to the complexity of managing a process whereby so many different actors are involved. And therefore, the planning process tends to be a participatory process, different stakeholders, but that functions best when the roles of different stakeholders are clearly identified. And so what we would like you to do, and again, it's a bit of an, I mean, it's an artificial exercise, but again, it will force you into some choices which you might not be comfortable with, but okay. The process of the planning process here, I can make a distinction between 5 steps. We set 4 questions, we gave them several different steps. Here now, I've summarized it into 5 steps. There's the analysis, there's the definition of priority, there is the design of programs and projects, there is the cost and financing, and there is the monitoring and evaluation. These are 5 different steps. And my question to you as a group is, in which one or maximum 2 steps of the planning process should you, as a group of professionals, be involved? You as a group of curriculum officers, where do you think you really have a contribution to make? Or where do you feel you really have something to say, and what you have to say should be respected? As a group of education officers, group of planners, statisticians, chief education officers, principals, where do you see your own contribution as being particularly important, and what is the nature of that contribution that you can make to those 1 or 2 steps? It's not an easy question, because you may feel, again, look, we should be there everywhere, and planners, statisticians in particular may feel, look, we are the planners, this is education planning. We should be there everywhere, but okay, if I ask you to choose, what do you feel are the areas, the steps where you are most needed, where you are most important, where your contribution will be most pertinent and most useful, and what contribution would you like to make? And it is now, I have to look, 11:35. I suggest that we come back at 12:10, so you have 35 minutes to discuss, and that, as previously, the previous reports were very, very brief. This again could be relatively brief, 5 minutes if possible. That will take us almost to 12:30, and we'll have then, if necessary, still a few minutes, but I can also afterwards give a feedback through either a little written contribution or a little audio or video or so, to give a feedback to these reports if we don't have the time in this synchronous session. Let me see if that is clear at the moment. Let me go back to the course and any points that is this clear, my colleagues Jacques and so on?
Yes, it's me only.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see hide your screen share bar. Yes, I'm sorry for the two colleagues who asked that. I don't see the chat, and I see that now. I'll do so. Sorry about that. I'll try to do so next time more carefully, because indeed it stops you from seeing some parts of the presentation I saw, and I'm just a bit afraid of sometimes touching things, because then before I realize it, something goes wrong. But I'll make sure that is done next time. Sorry about that. So is it okay to go back into the groups for everybody? All right, so let's go back into the groups. Ludivine, you can distribute, well, you can allow people to go back into the groups, and we'll come back at 12:10. That gives you 33 minutes for the discussion, and we'll briefly listen to the report. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Suppose. Good afternoon again. I think most of us have come back into the plenary session. I'm not sure if you were able to complete the discussions, but the purpose is not necessarily to settle every issue, but to gain some insight from the different groups. So I think we'll start the plenary discussion, and we have about 20 minutes left if necessary. I suppose we can take an extra 10, but I wouldn't like to go much beyond that. So what we'll do again is listen to each of the 5 groups. If you have a little presentation on a PowerPoint, feel free to show it. If not, it's not a big issue. You can just talk also. You remember the 2 questions. In which of these different steps do you feel you can make the most important contribution, and what type of contribution? And I suggest that this time we go the other way around. We'll start with the chief education officers, directors of education, and their assistants or deputies, and we'll go over principals, curriculum officers, education officers, to planners, statisticians. And we'll do as before. Those of you who are identified as reporters or presenters, you can go ahead and present. So maybe let me ask the group of chief education officers if you can make your brief presentation.
Okay, we looked at the steps involved in the planning process, and after some discussions, we felt that as professionals in our capacity, we must be definitely involved in the policy strategy area, and also in the monitoring and evaluation aspect. We recognize that in terms of the analysis and the assessment, the educational assessment, it's multi-sectorial, different groups of persons are involved in that. And so we can always get information to guide us as to the sort of policies and strategies that we need to to put in place. So whereas, yes, we may have some involvement in the first step, it doesn't have to be always direct, but we felt that when it comes on to the policy, because our position by virtue of its portfolio is a technical process. And remember also from your previous submission, you know, the education planning is a technical process, and it's also where we didn't really focus on the political because we're not too much involved in that. So hence the reason why we suggest that you know, the policy area is definitely a must for us. We also felt that the monitoring and evaluation aspect, even though we had some discussions, some people felt that the implementation was also important. But one of the arguments put forward was the fact that we more rely on the principals, the curriculum officers, education officers, and those persons to really manage that aspect. That is the implementation. They play a major role in the implementation because it's on the ground, it's school-based, it's institutionalized based, and so on. Whereas now, we as directors, chief education officers from our back end, we now need to make sure that we monitor and evaluate that process, have an oversight. And this is where we can really track progress, collect all the data that is necessary to know whether or not we're really meeting that futuristic goal. So in a nutshell, that's what we felt in terms of the two areas that we felt that were really critical for us in terms of our portfolio. We want to show though, there was the last part in terms of the planning process, but what we're supposed to do, just look at the 5 areas and expound on them. We want to clear that.
No, this was your answer was very clear and very well argued. That's exactly what I was looking for. And
Okay.
I tend to agree with you, but that's less important. It was very clear, it was very well argued. You feel as chief education officers, you want to be involved, you need to be involved mainly in policy and mainly in monitoring and evaluation. On the other steps, you can get information from others who will feed you with the information you need. And I thought that was very clear, very well argued. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. All right.
Okay, we'll go to the principals.
Hi, good morning. I want to share my screen, although there's nothing much here. How do I do that? Good. Can everyone see my screen? Nothing much, but we have discussed, and as principals, we believe that the definition of policy priorities and strategies would be what would be able to make a great impact on, because we should be able to be part of the discussion in making decisions, seeing that we are the ones who are on the ground and involved with the persons, like the students, for example. We also believe that we should be able to better provide the information for monitoring and evaluation, because we can give the feedback, which is absolutely necessary, because this is what we would observe while we are on the ground. We are the ones who would be able to decide what can work, what would not work. And so by being able to monitor and evaluate the process, the strategies and the priorities, we will be able to make informed decisions so as to guide the process at the ministry level. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That's again, that was clear and precise. I appreciate the discipline in the reporting. And it's interesting, we can come back to that if necessary a little bit at the end, that while you are evidently at another level to some extent of the administration, that you have identified the same areas as the chief education officers, and with, again, very convincing argument with a very good explanation. Let's go to the curriculum officers. In the meantime, if some of you have questions for the others who have presented, for the group who have presented, keep them in mind. We will have a little bit of time for discussion. Curriculum officers, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon. Lorraine Diali here, presenting for curriculum officers. During our discussion, our group realized that at different times we are involved in most of the steps of the planning process, except for cost and financing. However, when we looked at all of the steps, we agreed unanimously that we are most instrumental in the designing of programs and projects and the monitoring and evaluation.
Thank you. And can you give a bit more explanation why you feel that you're particularly important in those two areas?
Because we are also a technical support. We are expert in those fields of our fields, for example, science and math. If programs have to be developed for them, we should be instrumental in helping design those programs and projects. And also we are the one also in the field officers, going to the schools, so seeing whether those things are being implemented, and in that way we will be monitoring and evaluating how effective they are.
Okay, thank you. That indeed makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much. Let's go to the education officer.
Good morning, Vida here. At one point in time, we think that as education officers, we should be part of the discussion at every part of the process, if that makes sense. But since we had to select 2, we selected 3 and 5. So once the priorities have been identified, it means then that as middle managers, we need to be part of the design of the program. Whatever program is going to be designed for the schools, the districts, whatever it is, we need to be part of that so that there can be greater buying as officers. We know exactly what is happening on the ground, and so we are aware of the context. And if we are part of the design of the program, we can contribute towards the framework that is going to be put in place for monitoring and evaluating the process. We also think that we need to be part of monitoring and evaluating, since we are middle managers, frontline workers. We give information to principals or schools, and we take back information from the schools to the ministries. And so we need to be aware of what is happening, and we need to ascertain that the objectives of the programs are being met. So when we speak to the principals, we are giving them information that is from an informed perspective. And when we speak to the supervisors at the ministerial level, or supervisors, we are also giving them information from an informed perspective. And whatever information we get, it will guide what happens after. So if we are not part of the design, then really and truly we do not know what it is that we are going to monitor and evaluate. So I think the 2 integral parts are design and of the programs and monitoring and evaluation. Are we still here? Hello?
Yes, we're still here.
Sorry, it's me. It's my fault. I was talking without having unmuted. I was saying that was very clear again, and maybe not fully surprising that you position yourself mainly in the 2 areas, program design and monitoring evaluation, where also the curriculum officers are positioned themselves. You're not exactly the same people, of course, but you play roles that are somewhat similar. And I take your point, and the point also that the others made, that your role will be to some extent in each stage, but it will be very different. And I think the exercise you did was useful. These are the 2 most important areas. But go to planners and statisticians, who may have had the most difficult choice to make in this case.
Yes, Antoine, and certainly it was, especially given the dynamics of our group as planners and statistician. And so we would have discussed at length, where do we feature the most? And I just want to share with you some of the discussions that came up. And one being that depending the different countries, we have variation in terms of what constitute the planning officer. In some cases, you have one lone person being both statistician and the planner. And in other cases, you may have the planner, a researcher, and a stats person. And so based on those dynamics, though there were this conversation and discussions as to why persons selected the way they did. In addition to that, we also have the situation where measurement and evaluation, well, monitoring and evaluation, sorry, is basically ongoing. And as such, that could also spill over into the analysis aspect of it, as planning. The planning process is basically a cyclic process as well. I'm just referring to my notes to make sure. And so, depending on the hat that you wear at the time, the team would have voted that, of course, unanimously, monitoring and evaluation is critical. So most persons selected that particular option. And then the variations came in the analysis aspect of it, because we had quite a bit of statistician in that group. Choosing 11 persons out of 13 choosing analysis as being the other area, and 2 persons choosing definition of priorities, because the argument was made that you have more persons if you have the human resource, as some countries did, would be more involved in the analysis, and hence the planner themselves would basically be able to be guided by the analysis and then be featured more in making defining or making recommendations as to what the priority areas should be. So it was really an intense conversation, and I think we were able to see from the various angles, because of the fact that, as I said, the dynamics in countries are not necessarily the same, and it depends on the hat that you're wearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a difficult, at a certain moment, unfortunately, I couldn't hear you for just a short moment. So, but if I understand well, the 2 areas where you finally decided to concentrate on were analysis and policy priorities.
Analysis and monitoring and evaluation,
okay.
But there were 2 selection in definition and priority.
Okay, but if, I mean, the final choice was analysis and monitoring and evaluation.
Yes, it was.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe what I'll do is I've quickly summarized this on this slide, which I hope I can show now. For that, I need to share my screen. This, and you should be able to see this. It is not very, very clear, but I hope clear enough. And as you can see, I found that interesting. Can everybody see this?
Not yet.
No, I'm not seeing it at the moment.
We are seeing Anton has started sharing, but we're not seeing what he's sharing.
Yeah.
I don't understand. Maybe because it's a Word document. That's a bit of a problem. Okay, let me see if I can quickly. Why would that be? You see that I'm not a big fan of all this sort of thing, but okay. Let me see if I go into Power, if I add it as a PowerPoint. Just give me a second. In the meantime, if you have questions, you can reflect on it. I'm wondering if this will now be possible. I'm told that now I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, good. So you can see this. So where I've put the 5 groups and the choice you made. And I think what this, and evidently it is correct to say that to some extent you will probably play a role in many different areas, but that the important roles are different. It is not surprising, I think, that on the area of analysis, it is mainly planners and statisticians, because that is indeed quite technical work, though many of us would argue that the analysis is not only an analysis of the evolution of the education system, but an analysis also of the causes of the present phenomena, and maybe of the lack of progress or the progress in some areas, And that for the more causal analysis, you really need a debate and a discussion with the different actors. And that was what some of you had said, that you had to contribute to this. But the main responsibility arguably could be assigned to planners and statisticians. On the area of policy, again, it is not so surprising that it's chief education officers who feel that that is their privileged position to some extent. That principals feel they have to contribute to this because indeed policy finally plays out also at the school level, while the others, they will probably contribute to this, but somewhat less. The design of program, again, I think that does make a lot of sense to say that curriculum officers and education officers are the ones who are very well placed to feed into the design of programs, because to a large extent they will be the one, I mean, they know that field, they know what it means to do teacher professional development, they know what it means to develop a mathematics curriculum, they know what it means to strengthen school inspection and school supervision and so on and so forth. So they have to be involved there. That's their main area. No, nobody wants to take responsibility for cost and financing. Well, I'm not really sure if it's that, but it's not an area. To some extent, I expected planners and statisticians to play a role there. But what is important and both positive and somewhat preoccupying is the heavy emphasis that all of you put on monitoring and evaluation. It's maybe a reflection of an well, let me ask a few of you. Why do you think, not so much as as a group of individuals, but why do you think that almost everybody agreed that they have to play a role in monitoring and evaluation? Is there anybody who wants to?
Well, personally, I think the fact that we recognize that it's a process in itself, and at each sector or level, everybody needs to monitor what is happening. So it's a continuum. So the schools, institutions, maybe the hub of all the main activities, but they themselves need to monitor and evaluate what they're doing. Well, we can start within the classroom. The teacher monitors the children, the principals monitor the teachers, the principals are monitored by the officers at whatever level, whether it's curriculum or whatever, and then it comes up the chain. So by the time it reaches the ministry headquarters, you should have enough information to track progress and make the corrective measures. So everybody has to play a link, and I believe that's the reason why we all recognize that we have to play a role. It's an overlay, it's an interplay, interrelated, because without any particular group, we can miss something, and therefore not making the changes or the interventions that we need to do. So I believe that is why, from my perspective, why we feel collectively as a group, even though we have our specific areas or portfolio, we need to do that, because it's a continuum, it's a process, and so everybody has to play their role.
Yes,
Okay,
but Antoine, through you, Antoine, I have a question. Because even though we recognize monitoring and evaluation as critical and as key and as a broad-based in terms of all the groupings, it is one of the areas that is neglected the most. And so very often we have implementations that are happening, and there is no true way of determining whether or not what we're implementing really would have impacted the way because of the lack thereof. And that's a question I want to ask. Why do we recognize it as being important, but it is not done in the real sense of the term?
Can I take a stab at that?
Okay, go right ahead now.
I'm thinking on the same line as you, Stacey, because when I saw that, it was at once encouraging, and at the same time, it stirred several questions. One, exactly what you asked. And I'm wondering whether we as a region, because we have continued to flag this as an area of weakness, whether that might contribute to persons, at least their awareness of the need for M&E. Whether that awareness translates to practice is another question. And what are the factors that would affect that situation that we presently have with the M&E? For instance, earlier on, we spoke about the degree of inclusivity in the development as well as the implementation of any plan, whether it be a regional sector plan, a national sector plan, a district level plan. And if persons are not involved in the plan itself, some people don't even know that the plan exists, or they don't know what the plan contains, then how are they expected to monitor it?
Okay,
That's just one of the factors I wanted to mention.
That's a very interesting discussion. I won't want to stop it here, but to some extent I have to, because we are going beyond 12:30, and I don't want to spend too much time going beyond the time we are dedicated. I think, first of all, it is certainly not unique to the Eastern Caribbean. Both this somewhat paradoxical situation where there is an emphasis on monitoring and evaluation, and also disappointment with me. But I'm wondering if the disappointment is with the quantity of monitoring and evaluation, or with the quality and the usefulness. Let me explain a bit. I have the impression, but this is more based on other countries than the Eastern Caribbean, that actually there is quite a lot of monitoring going on. Principals do go into classrooms to see what teachers do. Teachers, of course, monitor student results through exams. Examination results are published and are used from time to time, not necessarily published, but at least publicly available. Some of them are used from time to time to make judgments about schools. There is collection of data at different moments, collection of data to prepare a statistical digest, or collection of data to respond to a specific ministry request or a specific minister's request. There are reports that schools prepare and so on. I think, I mean, I know that education officers, when they tend to go to schools, they tend to write in a school report and so on. I think actually that there is quite a bit of monitoring going on in the form of reporting. But I do believe that, I admit it's more based on international experience than necessarily on the local experience. Yeah, I do believe that there is a disappointment with the quality and the usefulness. A disappointment with the quality in the sense that the monitoring does not sufficiently help us. It's a writing down of the situation in terms of numbers, in terms of findings. It is not necessarily something that allows us to really reflect on causes, but that is not easy. Let's not think that that is so easy. Dropout is a phenomenon. The end of secondary school dropout or whatever. I mean, that is not necessarily something that we can just respond to. But that's certainly, I think, the first disappointment maybe. And the second disappointment, and that's very much related to the first, is that it does not regularly translate into action. And this is at least my main concern, that monitoring does not make sense if it does not lead to learning, and if that learning does not lead to action. And I have the impression that regularly we stop that cycle where monitoring should lead to learning should lead to new actions which lead to improvement. That regularly we stop that cycle at its first step. We monitor, and I mean, I don't want this to sound as a judgment on others, because I experience from time to time the same in my own work and even in my own institute, where we are also monitored regularly. We complete indicator reports and so on. We inform our director's office of what we're doing. And sometimes you do have the feeling that, okay, you fill in these things and nothing much happens with it. And so that's my impression at the moment, but it's something that could lead to a long discussion, and maybe we should not have it here. We will have a whole module on this, and we will also throughout the exercise make reference regularly to the whole issue that the purpose of monitoring is improvement and the purpose of planning is improvement. One point though, and that I think what Dr. Julius said that very clearly also, we are involved in monitoring at different moments and with different objects to a large extent. That does mean that the coordination of the overall monitoring exercise is also important, because the risk is, of course, that we over monitor and underuse the results of our monitoring. And for those who are the subjects or the objects, rather, if not the victims of the monitoring, that can be a very frustrating experience when you're over monitored, but you don't see the usefulness of that monitoring. I think the time is close to 1:45. Well, it's 12:37 here. Let me allow for a few more thoughts by participants, but I would like to stop though in at the latest 8 minutes from now at 12:45. Anybody else who would like to either respond to what I've said, and as I said already, I'm always happy to hear disagreements, or to add another point to the previous discussion.
Dr. Gregory has a question, I think.
Okay, Dr. Gregory, please go ahead.
Right, just to add to what you're saying, because we are, I mean, all of us around, and including yourself, it always has been the buzz area, the problematic area of the whole education planning. And while there is the technical aspect of it in terms of, your planning, and sometimes too, even in our plans, we don't even go into detail as to what and how we are really going to monitor. So we talk about stakeholder engagement and so on, so that everybody on board understand how are we going to be monitored and what are we going to do and what's the reasons for it and so on. So if we don't really see it as a process, it becomes a problem. There is also this, and I'm thinking from the more psychological, social aspect with regards to when it comes onto the word monitor and evaluation, it becomes problematic because the human tend to think that you're under the microscope. And once that starts happening, the whole interpersonal elements come into play and it breaks down the process. And so, teachers can feel resistant because they feel that you're judgmental rather than supportive. And the same way, the principal might not feel that, they may want to do certain types of monitoring evaluation and so on. So we can't underplay that aspect, that psyche. And I believe that is one of the problems we have with it over the years, because even sometimes when we ask persons who do research and we ask teachers to give us information about their principles, they don't rate it because there is that fear, that notion. And I think that sometimes that adds to the problem as to why we're not really getting the monitoring and evaluation as it ought to, and really seeing it as a process. So I believe to really mitigate against that, we have to make sure that when we do our monitoring evaluation, the planning of it, we are clear, everybody's clear, just like how when we're doing the priority areas and we're setting the goals and the strategies, we all are clear, we are giving our buy-in. We have to also buy in, everybody has to buy in as to how are we. So when the time comes for that to happen, we don't have any fear, we are comfortable, whatever the outcome is, we're gonna take it with good spirit and make the improvement and so on. So it's a mixture of the technical aspect in terms of the monitoring evaluation, but also the human aspect, which sometimes get into the way as to how effective the process may be.
Yeah, I fully agree with that point about the human element of it. It is the one area where it's very different to bring people together around the priority definition, because everybody feels they have a role to play, everybody feels they can contribute, and it's something that, as I said, creates enthusiasm, and everybody looks together forward to the future, a better country, more successful education system, and so on. And it's easy to a large extent to get people on board there. And you are fully right, once you go into monitoring and evaluation, to a large extent, you're talking about human relations which are characterized to some extent by you have the power over me. I exaggerate a little bit, but it is a little bit like that though. And that's why the emphasis should be on using monitoring and evaluation for learning, but that's always easier said than done. And so I think your emphasis on the human and the psychological social aspect is fully justified. Maybe a final comment from a colleague, and then we'll stop.
Yes, Vida here. I just wanted to add the whole idea of accountability, I think, should be brought in. And sometimes our monitoring and evaluating or evaluation may not be as effective as it's supposed to be, because sometimes people are not held accountable for what it is that they are supposed to do. And as we spoke earlier on, we said that if people are part of the program and part of the design, then there will be greater buy-in and there will be less resistance to monitoring and evaluating, because it's like I am not part of the process from the beginning, but as soon as there is a problem, I must go in and try to fix it. So sometimes, if we are not part of the process from the beginning, if there is resistance, and if people are not held accountable, then there is also resistance. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think that was a very useful final thought. I'll allow to say that it's the final one, because otherwise we will continue. I think indeed.
We just have another person, the CEO Finlay, raised their hand.
Okay, well, the final comment will then be, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I just want to ask a question in terms of monitoring and evaluation, because what I find is that as important as monitoring and evaluation is, most of the times the resources in any sector plan, there's always limited resources placed on that aspect, and I want to wonder why. Because it's important, but most of the time when you're costing and you're doing your project, you find that the M&E is always the one that is lacking the resources.
Good point, I think. A good point. I do remember at that moment we did a lot of research on school inspection, school supervision systems, and indeed when we looked, it's an illustration of your point. Your point goes beyond that, but when we looked at the amount of funding that was given to what we would call quality assurance within education systems, it was much lower than what many companies would identify as budget for quality assurance. And quality assurance is to a large extent a different term for monitoring and evaluation. I think it's a good point. I think it's again a bit linked to incentives, in the sense that the incentives to do monitoring and evaluation are rarely internal, they are externally imposed. It's something that we will need to examine in more detail in the last module. With your permission, and even to some extent without your permission, I would like to stop here. Otherwise, we do have many different issues that we will still need to address, and this was meant to be an introductory session. There are several issues on which we will come back. We had that whole discussion about the nature of the planning process in terms of participation, in terms of is it a top-down, bottom-up process, and we certainly have to come back to that in module 3. We have the discussion now here on monitoring and evaluation, and how monitoring and evaluation can become a more useful exercise, less threatening, more supportive, and that's something we will certainly come back to also in module 5, maybe also a little bit even in module 4 when we discuss quality improvement through, for instance, changing the nature of accountability, which is one of the topics we will discuss. We had the discussion also on the need for different stakeholders to be involved, and that again we'll look at module 3. And then much of your emphasis was on the need for planning to be evidence-based, and the next module will look in much more detail at how we can use existing evidence to make judgments about quality, equity, cost and financing, and management capacity. So for the moment, I think I would like to thank you for your very active participation. It's not always easy to remain interested and to remain attentive throughout the session. That finally was almost, 4 hours. That was a total of 4 hours. I've appreciated the discipline with which you did the group work and the concise reports and the well-argued reports. There will be on this first module a little, you cannot see me indeed, sorry. That's okay, maybe you're, whatever, sorry. So there will be a little, we're not going to give you an exercise to do as such, but we would like each country team to reflect a little bit on how they will organize their work over the modules that are coming. Sometime early next week, we will start putting PowerPoints on the platform for module 2, but we will inform you probably Monday morning how module 2 will be organized in more detail. In the meantime, if you have questions, as I mentioned already, you can either send them on the virtual platform through one of the fora, or you can write them directly to us, either through the virtual platform or through an individual email. If something did not work very well during this first synchronous session, feel free to share it with us. We want to learn also. We have our own point of view, but it's a very biased point of view in this case. And I will probably still look for one presentation that I can put on, or at least one short text that I can put on the platform about this whole discussion on the need for centralized or decentralized planning, where we have some ideas to share. I think I can say goodbye to everybody, wherever you may be in the Eastern Caribbean. And I wish you a good afternoon, a good remainder of the week. I thank my colleagues in Paris for their very effective support, the interns as well as my colleagues Ludivine, Jacques, Philippa, Farah, Lia, and Ocean. And we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. I will leave you now.
Good afternoon. Bye.